thing that I like to do, particularly at this particular stage, is actually create another actor component. And this is actually going to handle the inputs. So I'm going to call this one AC underscore input controls. And this is actually going to be something that I'm going to drop onto the play controller. And what this is essentially going to do is add or remove various input mappings from the play controller. So I'm going to go and create a new function. Let's call this one add input mapping. So get player controller. Let's see if I can remember what it is. Enhance. There we go. Get so it's enhanced input local player subsystem, and then want to add input. Add a mapping context. Like so. And then I'm just going to drag from the mapping context and just add that as an input. And then the last thing I'm actually going to do is from the options, I'm just going to drag from there and make modify context options. And I just want to make sure that the ignore all press keys until release is checked. So what that's going to do is if a key is already pressed and then you add something, it won't start registering that key until it's been released and pressed again, that type of thing, which certainly comes in handy if you're switching input mappings around. The next one I'm going to do is just remove. Actually, I'll probably just duplicate that one actually. I'm just going to call this one remove input mapping. So remove context. There we go. So this one's very similar to the other one. The only difference is this is going to remove that particular input mapping. Okay, just like so. And then I want to add that to the player character, the play controller, which I'm not sure if we have one yet. That's the game mode. Double check. Okay, yeah, so we don't actually have one set up yet, so I'm just going to quickly add one. So new play controller. So, and then we're just going to add that. Is that set up correctly? Yes. And then we're just going to add that component, so the input controls. So, and the last thing to do is just make sure it's actually using that. So I'm going to update the game mode. So the play controller class, just want to update that from the default play controller to the new one that we've created. So that itself is all done. So we've got these two basic functions. It just means that anywhere, really, it's quite easy just to get the play controller and get this particular component. And if there's other things that you want in regards to modifying player inputs and things like that, you'll be able to do it in here. That way anything can sort of get access to those quite easily, so you're not having to repeat yourself quite a lot. So if we come back to the AC interaction, what we can then do is just get player controller, and then we can use the get component by class. And if we just search for that input controls, we can then choose to add input mappings. So what we can then do is if we're actually interacting with something and we're showing that we can interact with it, we can actually then enable that interaction using that input mapping, which we may have set up a few in a second. Let's do it this way. And if we can't, as in we've not hit anything, then we can just remove an input mapping. Okay, that's so. So at the moment, if we look at here, obviously there's only the main default input mapping, which isn't going to be that useful, because if we remove that, then we're not going to be able to move around at all. So what I'm actually going to do is create a new input map. I'm going to call this one IMC. I'm just going to call this one interact. And this one's going to be fairly straightforward. It's just going to have the interact input action that we've already created in the previous episode. So the previous tutorial, shall I say, assign that to E. And I'm actually going to go to the default one and remove it. So that way, whenever we go to interact with anything, whether or not it allows us to interact is all based on this particular component. So what we can then do is on the add input mapping, we can add it and then we can remove it. So we're just choosing it from the list. So with that done, it should still work. So we press and hold. Okay, it doesn't seem to be doing anything. So let me just double check a few things. So let's check to make sure it's actually getting there first. So we will drag that into the background. Make sure it's selected up there. Okay, so it is attempting to update it. So that's okay. So we'll go to the third person. So that's selected, and then we'll check that one. So when I'm pressing the button, that is firing. Okay, so that seems to be okay there. So let's come to the core. Let's see what's happening in here. Okay, so it's not doing anything just yet. Let's go. So what I'm going to have to do is possibly throw in some print strings. I want to get the current hold duration. Okay, so that's not actually updating. Okay, I can see what I've done here. So back in here, I've hooked it up on start instead of triggered, so it's only actually triggering it once. So that should hopefully fix that. Yeah, so now it's updating accordingly. Okay, I'm just going to go in and remove that print string. Okay. Okay, so the next thing, well, so the last thing that I want to do really is in here, just on the functions, I want to override the trigger interact as well. This time, however, what we're actually going to do is just add some additional functionality. So what we can do is we want to just remove that interaction input mapping. So if we've interacted with something, we want to disable it. And that sort of helps prevent it from triggering again multiple times. So that way, if we want it to trigger again, then we have to go through that in the core. We have to go through the recheck hits option, which will essentially re-enable it if it needs to. So we've got a bit of control there. So that way, if we're interacting with something like the NPC, for example, we remove the interact again, so it doesn't work, and then we can choose to re-enable it when we've finished interacting with them. So in here, yeah, so that should do that. Yeah, so if I actually come in and put back in the print string on here, you'll see the effect that adding that on actually does. So if I get the current hold duration again, should have probably kept it in to begin with. So if we go ahead and interact, you notice that the moment that dialog box pops up, the print string stops. For us to go back into here and just unhook it and then do it, it will continue to increase, so it's still essentially triggering that interact, which isn't always sort of desirable. So it kind of just removes that interaction. So I'm going to quickly hook that back up. So you can kind of see why I have included that particular option in there regarding the input mappings. Okay. Right then, so I'm just trying to think the next best thing to do would probably be the UI side of things. So before I move on to that, I thought I think it might be a good idea just to explain why it is I've actually broken this up into 3 separate components. So if I was to come and look at the base and look at the size map, it shows you essentially how much space this will take up when this particular object is created. So in this case, sort of 10 kilobytes. If we go to the core, you can see it's starting to increase a little bit. So that's 154 kilobytes. And then if we go to the main interaction one that we've currently got on the character, again this size map's gone up even more. So there's sort of more stuff that's sort of in there. Now the reason why it's sort of split up is if at any point, if any other actor wants to in essence get what the player is looking at, so what they're interacting with, all they ever need to get to is the base, which is only 55 kilobytes, because they don't need to know everything else that's in these two. They only need to get access to what's in here. The great thing about doing it this way as well is it actually prevents you from accidentally changing something that you probably shouldn't be within another blueprint that could then affect how it functions, especially if it's done unintentionally. Obviously, whilst ideally we'd set things as private and stuff like that to try and mitigate it, it's too easy to forget these days, especially when you've got so many variables to contend with, and you're adding and removing them. It's quite easy just to forget that that's what you need to do for some of them. But doing it this way as well, it's like another sort of line of defense against that, really. But for me, the main one, like I said, is just helping reduce the size map when things are being referenced. So this sort of approach you can also do for other things as well. NPCs could be a good one. So if you look at the NPC, obviously it's quite high because in essence it's having to reference everything regarding the actual skeletal mesh and things like that. So once it's loaded into memory, it's not going to be an issue. But if something is referencing, say, an NPC directly, but it's not actually been loaded yet, it would still need to load everything for whatever it's for it to function, even though what it's referencing isn't actually in the world yet, if that makes sense. But all that data still needs to be loaded into the RAM. So it can just be a nice way of helping control that side of things, really. So with that said, that sort of brings us into sort of the UI side of things. So when it comes to user interfaces, they themselves can actually be quite large, and as you've probably gathered, they're not always needed. So if I was to put all the UI stuff inside of this interaction component, anything that then referenced to it would then have to make sure that everything from the UI perspective is loaded into RAM, whether it's on the screen or not, which can obviously, it's not ideal. So one sort of approach that I've sort of gone with, particularly for this system, is just to separate it completely. So yet again, we're going to come in, create a new actor component, and this time I'm going to call this one UI Manager, like so. And this particular actor component, we're also going to place onto the play controller. So the play controller also has quite a close connection to the user interface because it's all handled through there. So it makes sense just to pop it onto there. The great thing about putting it on here as well is if anything does actually need to reference it for whatever reason, it can do. It can just get it from the play controller, similar to how we get the input controls. So with that done, what I'm then going to do is look at sort of a few things out on the begin play. So what we can do is let's move. I'll just remove that for now. We will need to get a reference to that interaction component. So we can get the player character, and then we use the get component by class. And then we can just go ahead and put that to a variable, and this is going to be the interaction component. So we'll essentially be looking in here for anything regarding the UI. So as an example, if I was to actually come to the UI manager and look at the size map, is that saved? Nope. Compile and save. Make sure it's all updated. So if we look at the size map, it's not updated. But yeah, it should show a reference to the component, the interaction component that we've gotten. Although actually it would probably help us select it in here. So we will. So for this one, we just want to get the base. Now if we try it, there we go. So you can see that that's what it's referencing. But if in here, if we actually get the main one, you'll see that the size would then balloon. It would increase quite a lot, just because there's a lot of other stuff in there that this particular thing just doesn't ever need to know about. Which is one of the reasons why we did use that sort of base core and the main active component sort of structure when creating this. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually create the widgets. So we've got our interaction component, we've got a reference to it, so we get the data, but we haven't actually got anything that we can actually show on the screen. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a new user widget. So you come to content browser, user interface, and then widget blueprint. I'm just going to use the default user widget, and I'm going to call this to be underscore interaction prompt. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and just set this up to look a particular way. So I'm going to start with a canvas panel, and then I'm going to drop an overlay in there. So the overlay is something I can just move around. I'm going to change the anchors to center, make sure its position is zeroed out, set the size to content, and then inside there I'm going to put in an image. So I'm going to kind of use this as the background in a sense. Put that to a grey colour. And then once we've done that, I want to make sure that's on fill horizontally and vertically, and then I want to pop in a horizontal box on the overlay, and then I want to fill on that one as well, and then I'm going to put in a size box inside the horizontal box, and then a text next to it. So make sure these are centered accordingly. Okay, I'm just going to change that text to interact. We will set it up so you can actually choose what the text is based on what you're interacting with, but for now as the default it'll say interact. For the size, the size box itself, I'm going to pop in a widget switcher. So where the size box is, that's essentially going to show the icon, so kind of like sort of the key that it is that you want to press to be able to interact. And then when you actually start to interact, I'm going to get it so it switches to like a radial progress bar. So for that, I'm going to just update the size, so the width and height override to 48. So that way, anything that's placed inside here, it'll sort of maintain that distance, so that size as it were. On the interact text, let's just change that from bold to regular, and then on the left and the right, put some padding, so 15, it doesn't seem too bad, and then I'm just going to pop on some left padding on the, not the widget switcher, on the size box I believe. That looks quite a lot, so try 8. Okay. Okay, so that's not too bad. Then next thing we can do is drop another image inside the widget switcher. Oh, I suppose we need two really. So I'm just going to quickly rename some of these. So the widget switcher, I'm going to call that the timer switcher. And then image, the first one, that's going to be the icon button. So this is kind of like the key that you need to press. And then this one's going to be the radial icon. Let's put it as icon radial, there we go. And then lastly, this one's just going to be the interact text. And we just want to make sure that is listed as a variable as well, so we can update that. Okay, so we're sort of getting somewhere. What I'm going to quickly do is just copy some of the colours from here, just so it matches. Yeah, consistency. Paste that on there. Okay, that's that done. Okay, yep, and I don't actually have any icons in here at the moment, so if you just bear with me, I'm just going to quickly get one, sort of an icon, so we're back in a second. Okay, so I'm back. So I've gone ahead and just created a keyboard icon for the letter E. So this is the texture. What I'm going to do as well is on the texture group is actually change it to UI. This just helps make sure that the texture is essentially being used correctly in regards to it being displayed on the as the UI element. So that's done. We can comment out. Make sure that's saved. Oh. So if we go back to the interaction prompt, I'm just going to update that icon there to use that particular key. So it's going to be the default. Okay, so yeah, so for the next icon I want to do, that's for the actual radial icon. So this is kind of like the little timer that will sort of fill up in a circle, just sort of indicate to the player how long that mouse press has been held for. And obviously once it's filled, then it'll trigger the actual interact. So this particular one, it's going to be a little bit different because it's not just an icon like the main interact button. So what we actually need to do is create a dynamic material instance. So to do that, we first need to actually create the material. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead to the materials folder in the content browser, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new material. I'm going to go ahead and call this one mat underscore, I'll just call it radial, like so, and then go ahead and open that one up. So when it comes to materials, obviously it's not my strongest point, so I will try and explain it as best as I can. But I like to think that with a lot of these, when you sort of preview the nodes, it sort of gives you a bit more of an idea as to what it's actually doing in terms of manipulating things. So the first thing we need to do is if we actually click on the main material sort of output node, as it were, what we need to do is actually change a few of these settings. So the first one to do for the material domain, we want to change this one to user interface. You'll notice that a lot of the options disappear, which is perfectly fine. And then lastly, on this particular node, we just need to change the blend mode from opaque to translucent, and that gives us the opacity option there. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to actually kind of create a sort of sweeping radial effect itself. So there's a few things that we need to do to get that sorted. So I'm going to go ahead and start by creating a texture coordinate node, and you just leave that on index 0. And then we want to plug that into a constant, if I can spell it correctly, constant bias scale. So if I just set this to start previewing the node, it should give you sort of an example on the left hand side as to what it's actually doing. So there are a few settings we do need to adjust on here. So the first one is the the bias setting, and that needs to be minus 0.5. And you'll notice it sort of changes already. So it's kind of like pushed, in essence, this pattern where it's going from red through to green. It sort of pushes it from the top left, essentially down to the middle. And then you have the scale, which is kind of like the brightness. So I'm just going to set that to 2, like so. The next thing we want to do is plug that. I should stop previewing that node. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and plug that into a custom rotator. And we need a few inputs on this particular node. So for the rotation center, I'm just going to do that as a constant. I'm just going to leave that at 0. So that's essentially, as far as I'm aware, that's just the middle of the texture space. And then the next one we need is to make the rotation angle. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and create another constant, and then just right click on it and convert it to a parameter. And I'm going to call this one starting point. And then want to come in and divide that by 360. So this will essentially just give us the radial percentage. So if this was 180, then the output on here would be 0.5 as an example. What we then want to do is actually subtract that value from 1. So it kind of like inverts the sort of direction. So if it's 0.1, then it becomes 0.9 instead. So it kind of just flips the direction that it rotates around. If I was to go ahead and plug this in, we'll preview on this one. So if we start adjusting some of these settings, hopefully let's do it as 45 increments, you can sort of see how it's rotating. Like so. So that's kind of the sort of effect we're going for. The next thing we do want to do is actually just add a bit of like a starting offset to this. So the way I'm going to do that is just add 0.25 into the rotation angle, and that just makes it so that it starts at the this sort of section there where the cursor is, and it'll go round clockwise. Okay, so I'm just going to stop previewing that node. So with that done, we then want to convert that into a radial value. So we can actually call the node vector to radial value, like so. And again, if we just start previewing that node, you sort of see the effect that that's having. So it's taking it from the top corner and kind of like stretching it round almost into a circle. Once we've done that, we then just want to actually just invert what it's giving us. So if we do 1 minus, so we'll preview that again. And that just sort of converts it into this black and white image that we can see there. So hopefully you're starting to see how that radial effect is starting to take shape. The next thing we want to do is actually kind of cut it off at certain points. So if it's at like a 90 degree, then you'd only have like this top right section showing, or if it's a 45, you'd have like a triangle. So the next thing we want to do to accommodate for that is I'm going to go ahead and create another constant and then just convert it to a parameter. I'm going to call this one the range. So you can sort of think of this as kind of like the fill range. Of course, if you feel like there's better names you can use for these parameters, then obviously by all means use them. Obviously it's just the names that I've used. So the range itself, it would be in sort of degrees. So obviously 45 degrees or 180, 270, that type of thing. Yet again, what we want to do is actually subtract that from 360. And yet again, that's just to help with the sort of orientation as it fills. Once we've done that, we then just need to multiply that. And we want to multiply this by 1 divided by 360. You could just have a constant here with the actual value, but I've chosen just to do it that way. And then we can do another subtract from here, and then actually subtract the 1 minus here. So if you start previewing this particular node, you should hopefully start to see what's happening. So if we change the value here to 90 for the range, and then do another 180, 270. You can sort of see how that's going round. So I'm going to set this back to 45 for now as a preview. So what we now need to do is actually sort of, I'm trying to think of the right word for it, so sort of like solidify sort of the section that we want, which is predominantly black, but there's lots of, still a bit of a grey edge here that, going into the white that we don't want. So what we can do with this, in this particular case, actually use something called a seal. And what this will do, it'll sort of rounds all the values up, I believe. It's the nearest one. So with the seal, obviously it's doing what we want, but along the edge, I'm not sure if you're able to see it on the camera, but it is a little bit pixelated just because it's, you know, it's absolute almost. So there's no sort of anti-aliasing or anything on that edge. So what we can do instead is there's actually another node called smooth seal, where we can specify kind of like a ramp width. So what I'm going to do is add a constant to this value. I'm just going to set it to something like 0.01 or 0.2. It's something you can sort of play around with yourself to figure out the best sort of option for you. But if I was to sort of preview that, and then just have a quick play around with the values, that's too high. It might be. Let's try 0.1. It doesn't seem too bad. And then we'll just want to do a 1 minus again on this. And that just inverts it. So the bit that we have is the white bit. So we'll start previewing that node. Okay. So yeah, so the smooth seal, again, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it clearly on the video, but it just helps preserve a little bit of a softer edge where the sort of cursor is running down that edge there. So you just want to have a play with this sort of ramp width to control how smooth that is. So you can sort of see that in action. So it's quite a low value. Do you get a bit of loss at the outer edge? Something like that. There we go. Okay. Okay. So with that done, we essentially have the mechanism here where it sort of fills up depending on the range value that's set here. But what we now need to do is kind of like mask that off based on an actual circular sort of donut shape. So before we can do that, we need to set up the actual donut, as it were. So I'm just going to come down sort of this section here, and I'm going to create another constant, and this time I'm going to convert that to a parameter as well, and I'm going to call this one the outer radius. And I'm going to call this one, put value there of 0.5, and then I'm going to, we kind of need to do two sort of branches here. So we want to create the outer circle and then the inner circle. So I'm going to start by doing a clamp and clamp it between 0 and 0.5, and then we can plug that into a radial gradient exponential, and we can plug that straight into the radius section on the node. And then for this, we then just want to add a density as well. I'm going to go ahead and use another constant. For this, I'm going to use 20. Yet again, you can play around with this particular value. But if we start previewing the node, you should hopefully see what we've got here. So now we have a circle. If we change the outer radius, it makes it smaller. 0.5 tends to be, takes it up to the edge, from what I've found. If you make it any higher than that, so set that to 6, in some cases it might sort of clip out of the material bounds. So not making much more of a difference there. So at 0.5. This particular value here that I've got set to 20 is kind of like the, so if I set it to 10, I don't think it's quite as noticeable. Let's set it to 1. Yeah, so you can sort of see sort of density. So the higher the number is, the more crisp the circle is. So if I set it something like 100, get quite a sharp edge along there. So yet again, it's just a case of playing around with the numbers and see what you're happy with for your particular project. So with that done, we then want to go ahead and create the other circle for the middle. So just copy the gradient exponential, and we can go ahead and plug the 20 in again to the density just to make sure it's the same. You can use different ones if you wanted to. Depending on the size of the circle, it might not make too much of a difference. So it's a case of just figuring out what's best for your particular project. So in terms of the clamp, so we do still need a clamp, but this time what we want to do is on the actual input for the clamp, we want to add another parameter. So this one's going to be called the inner radius. And I'll start by setting that to like 0.3. And then for the for this, we want to set the actual max value. And what I'm going to do is take the outer radius and actually just subtract an amount. For this, I just use 0.05, 0.005, there we go, for the max. And then we just take the top one and subtract the bottom circle. So if we start previewing this, you should hopefully start to see what's happening there. So if I was to set that linear radius to 5, because of this clamped value here, it'll always be like 0.495. So that's kind of like the smallest it would be. So that's what this particular subtract node is for. So the smaller the value, sort of the chunkier that particular line will be. So yeah, with something like this, it's just a case of figuring out what value is best for your particular project. So if you want one that's a bit skinnier, you just increase the inner radius. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is sort of combine the two. So the way we can do that is by using a multiply. So if we come from the top one and just multiply these two together. Like so, and then we do a start preview on that. Just start to see what's happening here. So you got that bit of circle, but it's based on the wedge that's generated from the top section. The last sort of step to do is to sort out the color. So we can go ahead and add a constant 3 variable, and we just plug that into the final color. So if it's red, then the output will be red. Usually helps if I confirm those. Yep. And then what we want to use is, oh sorry, that's not the right one we want to use. It's a constant vector 4 that we want, and we can actually convert that to a parameter as on called like color. So plug that top one back in, make sure the alpha's at 1, and then what we can do is just multiply the alpha on the color by all the logic that we've done before, and plug that into the opacity. So if we were to set the color up to a particular color, you can sort of see that change effect on the left hand side there. And it should be affected by the opacity of the color as well. So if you wanted it to be a sort of slightly transparent, you can do that through just the color itself. I'm going to go ahead and just set this to white as the default color. Okay. So there we go. So that's the base sort of material, as it were. So let's save it. So with that done, we can then go back to the content browser, just select the material, and right click on it and create material instance. I'm just going to call this material radial instance. And inside here, that's where you can sort of change the variables. So if you wanted to use the main radial material for other types of radial things, you can have different instances with different inner and outer radiuses, for example, in different colors, and then you just use whichever instance you need. But in this instance, I only need one, so that's it. So that's that particular thing done.